Burma. March 1945. The jungle is alive with heat and dread. The morning mist hangs low, curling between banyan roots and rusted wire. Cicadas cry in the distance, a sound soon devoured by something mechanical. From beyond the tree line comes a low rumble, then the crushing of bamboo. The ground trembles, birds scatter, and through the thick vines, the shape of a beast emerges, steel, mud-caked, and hissing, a Churchill crocodile. Its turret turns slowly, deliberate as a predator. A moment later, the sound changes. A deep pulse of pressure, followed by a roar that tears through the air. A column of fire surges forward, washing across a Japanese bunker carved into the hillside. The flame clings, crawls, and devours. Inside, men scream, the sound muffled by dirt and flame. The jungle, moments ago a cathedral of insects and wind, now glows with human terror. Somewhere in the smoke, a soldier whispers a prayer. Too late, too quiet. The tank keeps moving forward, and this was how the jungle turned into fire. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a nightmare of mud, flame, and fanaticism. The Japanese Empire, once sweeping across Asia with unstoppable speed, now fought for survival. Every island, every ridge, every patch of jungle had become a fortress. In Burma, British and Indian forces pushed through swamps and fever-ridden valleys toward Mandalay. In the Philippines, American divisions clawed their way through the dense, wet jungles of Luzon. Across the Pacific, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, Japanese troops refused to surrender, fighting to the last man. It was no longer a war of maneuver. It was a war of eradication. The Japanese defense doctrine was simple and brutal. Dig deep, disappear into the earth. Wait. Strike when they least expect it. They carved bunkers from coral and clay, reinforced them with logs and earth, and turned the jungles into mazes of hidden death. Machine guns were buried in roots. Snipers watched from the shadows. And beneath the soil, tunnels connected the living to the dying. Conventional Allied firepower struggled here. Artillery shells vanished into the foliage, their shock waves dampened by the canopy. Airstrikes missed camouflaged positions. Infantry attacks dissolved into confusion. Ambushes, crossfire, disease. The jungle absorbed everything, including men's courage. By 1943, Allied commanders faced a brutal truth. To root out the Japanese from their holes, they had to bring hell closer to the ground. That hell came in liquid form, a weapon that could reach into the very earth and suffocate resistance. The flamethrower. At first, it was a man's weapon, heavy, clumsy, and terrifying to both sides. Carried on the back like a coffin, its tanks held thickened gasoline mixed with napalm. The weapon's range was short, barely 30 yards, and its operator rarely lived long enough to empty the tanks. Snipers hunted them. A single bullet could turn them into human torches. But in the Pacific, the flamethrower became essential. It was the only weapon that could clear caves, trenches, and bunkers without committing entire platoons to suicide. Fire burned what bullets could not. It destroyed morale, oxygen, and hope. Still, its limitations were obvious. Operators could not advance under heavy fire, and their fuel supply vanished within seconds. The solution, terrifying in its simplicity, was to mount the weapon on armor. By 1944, British and American engineers began converting tanks into instruments of fire. The British modified their reliable Churchill tank, creating the Crocodile, a flamethrower system powered by pressurized nitrogen, capable of projecting a jet of flame over 100 yards. Its fuel trailer, towed behind the tank, carried hundreds of gallons of flammable mixture. The Americans followed suit, developing Sherman-based flamethrower tanks like the M4A3R3 Zippo. For Allied infantry slogging through the jungle, These machines were salvation. For the Japanese, they were something else entirely. The Japanese soldier was trained to face death with honor. But nothing in Bushido prepared him for liquid fire. Machine guns could be met with courage. Artillery could be endured. But fire, living, moving, consuming, was beyond endurance. It melted the distinction between bravery and terror. Reports from the Pacific spoke of defenders abandoning fortified positions the moment a flamethrower appeared. Others described suicide charges, men throwing themselves beneath tank tracks rather than burn. Entire caves fell silent after a single burst. By the end of 1944, the jungle had become a stage for a new kind of warfare, one that was both primitive and technological. Steel met soil, fire met flesh, and for the first time, the fear of flame overshadowed the fear of death itself. The Allies understood its power not only as a weapon, but as a message, a visible sign that no bunker was safe, no defense too deep. The psychological toll on Japanese forces began to fracture even their legendary resolve. And yet, behind that curtain of fire, the story was far more complex. One of adaptation, engineering, and a brutal race to end a war that refused to die. The next stage would not only change how tanks fought, it would change how men thought about war itself. By late 1944, Allied armies had learned one painful truth. In the jungles and islands of the Pacific, firepower alone could not win. The terrain itself was the enemy, humid, tangled, and hostile to machines. Tanks bogged down in mud, visibility vanished within meters, and every approach road became an ambush. But against Japanese fortifications carved into hillsides or hidden in bamboo, the need for something that could both endure and destroy was absolute. That something became the flamethrower tank. The British were first to field a true battlefield-ready version, the Churchill Crocodile. Based on the Churchill Mark VII, it was a fortress on tracks. Instead of carrying a cannon alone, the Crocodile's 75mm gun was joined by a flame projector mounted in the hull. Behind it trailed a heavily armored trailer containing 400 gallons of fuel and compressed gas. A press of a switch could unleash a tongue of fire over 120 yards, long enough to reach any pillbox entrance or cave mouth. The Americans took note. The standard M4 Sherman, reliable, mobile, and available in huge numbers, was modified into several flamethrower variants. The M4A3R3 Zippo, used by the U.S. Marines, was among the most infamous. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Shermans equipped with the Navy-designed POA CWS H-1 system cleared out bunkers one by one, reducing fortified hillsides into smoldering ruins. Some could maintain a continuous flame for nearly a minute, an eternity in combat. These machines didn't just alter tactics, they transformed the psychology of the battlefield. To the men inside them, they were both protection and prison. Tank crews described the suffocating heat, the fuel stench, the feeling of being a walking target for grenades and mines. They advanced through jungles so thick that branches scraped their armor, and vines wrapped their gun barrels. Any hit could ignite the fuel trailer, a fate feared almost as much as capture. Yet, they moved forward because infantry could not. To those facing them, Japanese defenders armed with rifles, grenades, and desperate resolve, the sight of these tanks was apocalyptic. Many Japanese soldiers had been taught that surrender was shameful and death in battle was noble. But fire robbed them of that choice. It burned through air holes and seeped into bunkers where no bullet could reach. Caves became furnaces. In Okinawa, Marine reports describe entire Japanese positions silenced after one pass of a Sherman Zippo. On Luzon, infantry watched as flames rolled into pillboxes and emerged from cracks in the earth, drawing screams that haunted even hardened veterans. British forces saw similar horror in Burma. Against the entrenched defenders at Meiktila, Crocodiles moved in line with Indian infantry. The tank's operators worked methodically, burning through undergrowth to expose hidden positions. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial blasts often ran into machine gun fire or artillery, unable to see, blinded by smoke and flame. For the Allies, these tanks solved what had seemed unsolvable: how to dig an enemy out of a jungle fortress without losing a battalion. For the Japanese, they shattered the myth of invincibility that had carried their armies since 1941. But the use of flamethrower tanks also revealed something deeper: the industrial imbalance of the war. Japan lacked the oil, steel, and infrastructure to build comparable weapons. Their tanks, like the Type 95 Heigo and Type 97 Chiha, were lightly armored and undergunned, designed for mobility, not confrontation. Against a Sherman or Churchill, they were almost helpless. As the flames rolled through the jungles of Burma and the islands of the Pacific, Japan's tactical genius, ambush, stealth, sacrifice, met the full weight of Allied engineering. By 1945, the presence of a single flamethrower tank could decide an entire engagement. Infantry no longer needed to storm bunkers. The tanks did it for them. On Okinawa, U.S. commanders coordinated flame and demolition teams, tanks, engineers, and infantry working in deadly rhythm. In Burma, the British used crocodiles to support the Martwitian Army's final drive toward Rangoon, their jets of fire clearing roadblocks and caves that artillery could not touch. Every burst of flame carried not just destruction, but a message. The jungle was no longer a refuge. For the Japanese soldiers hidden beneath its roots, the very ground began to betray them. Fire turned the safety of the underground into a tomb, and as the Allies advanced, the terror of the flamethrower tank spread faster than the fire itself. Whispered in bunkers, recorded in diaries, carried on the smoke rising over the canopy. The stage was set. Soon, the Allies would bring these weapons into the heart of Japan's defenses. In battles where courage, fear, and flame would collide. For the Japanese soldier, the jungle had always been a sanctuary. It was concealment, protection, and advantage. Hidden beneath its green shroud, a man could vanish into the earth and strike unseen. But when the flamethrower tank arrived, that sanctuary turned into a trap. Accounts from surviving Japanese veterans, though rare, describe the same sensation: helplessness. There was no counter to fire, no place to hide. Bunkers that had once resisted artillery for days were destroyed in seconds. Men who refused to surrender faced a death so absolute that even their comrades could not recover their bodies. Private Shigeo Nishimoto of the 24th Division later recalled, "We waited underground, hearing the tanks above us. Then came the fire. We could not breathe, and the earth glowed. It was like the air itself was burning." For Allied soldiers, the feeling was different, but equally haunting. American Marines advancing behind flamethrower Shermans spoke of the stench. The smell of burning vegetation mixed with something far worse. Some tried not to look. Others stared in silence as flames consumed entire positions that had resisted for days. It was a strange mixture of relief and horror. Relief that they wouldn't have to storm another cave. Horror at what they had unleashed. In letters home, many simply wrote that it ended fast. But in truth, fire changed them. In the Pacific, compassion often disappeared with the smoke. After seeing their comrades mutilated or captured, mercy was a luxury few could afford. The jungle, once indifferent, had become a place of vengeance. And the flamethrower tank, silent, methodical, unfeeling, became its executioner. In Europe, Lieutenant Abidi Doskunain Tertu, tanks maneuvered across open ground, supported by infantry and artillery. In the Pacific and Burma, they crawled through tunnels of foliage, blind and vulnerable. The jungle dictated tactics, not commanders. Standard armor formations were impossible. Tanks could barely move in single file, guided by infantry with machetes who cleared paths 1 yard at a time. Mines, ambushes, and steep ravines made every advance uncertain. Japanese defenders exploited this perfectly. They positioned their guns not in front, but on the flanks, waiting for tanks to pass before striking their exposed sides. Conventional tanks suffered terrible losses this way. But flamethrower tanks turned those ambush zones into kill zones of their own. Instead of pushing straight through, commanders began using them as breaching tools. Infantry would locate a suspected bunker or cave. Engineers marked its approach. Then the flamethrower tank rolled forward, often within yards of the target. It fired not in bursts, but in controlled streams, sweeping across openings like a scythe. The effect was immediate. Smoke, screams, silence. The key tactical change was not speed, but patience. In the jungle, every yard was contested, and every burst of flame created a shockwave of panic. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to fight to the death, now faced something they could neither resist nor attack effectively. In Burma, crocodile units operated in close coordination with infantry. A single tank could clear multiple bunkers before pausing to refuel. In the Philippines, U.S. Marines used Sherman Zippos to clear entire ridge lines. Flame was now both weapon and signal. Once the fire started, Allied troops advanced. Commanders noted an unintended benefit: psychological warfare. Reports indicated that Japanese resistance often collapsed after the first tank fired. Men fled bunkers, abandoning weapons, leaving behind positions that would have otherwise cost dozens of Allied lives to take. Tactically, the flamethrower tank restored mobility, not through speed, but through fear. It forced the enemy to move, to expose themselves, to break the rhythm of defense. The the flamethrower tank was a brutal fusion of chemistry and engineering. Its heart was not the cannon, but the flame projector, a narrow, reinforced barrel capable of channeling thickened fuel under enormous pressure. The Crocodile's system used nitrogen to propel its mixture. The Sherman variants often used compressed air, or CO2. The British Crocodile's trailer carried nearly 400 gallons of flame fuel, connected to the tank by an armored pipe that could detach if hit. The Sherman Zippo's design was simpler. Internal tanks replaced the hull machine gun, giving it greater maneuverability but limited range. Fuel composition varied. But by 1944, most used napalm, a gelled gasoline that adhered to any surface it touched. Ordinary flames burned upward. Napalm clung and crawled. It turned the act of firing into an act of suffocation. Range was crucial. The Crocodile's jet could reach over 100 yards, allowing it to attack without exposing itself directly. The American Zippo's effective range was shorter, around 60–80 yards, but its fuel mix burned hotter. Both could fire in short bursts or continuous streams. Depending on pressure control, each burst consumed about 4 to 5 gallons of fuel, meaning a tank could deliver roughly 60–80 seconds of continuous flame before refueling. Crews carried spare filters, valves, and igniters, knowing a single malfunction could turn the tank into a bomb. Yet, for all its terror, the system was astonishingly reliable. Reports from field maintenance units praised its durability under tropical conditions, a rare compliment in jungle warfare. These tanks embodied a simple equation: replace vulnerability with volume. A human flamethrower carried seconds of fire. A tank carried minutes. A man could be killed before he fired. A tank could burn through an entire hill before stopping. But the technology's brilliance also exposed the moral chasm of total war. The engineers built efficiency. Soldiers delivered horror. Every improvement in range and pressure translated directly into human suffering. And in 1945, as Allied forces prepared for the final push into Japanese strongholds, that efficiency would be tested on an unimaginable scale. Fire was no longer a support weapon. It was a doctrine, the weapon of inevitability. Next came those who wielded it not just as a tool, but as a strategy. Commanders who saw flame as the key to breaking an empire. In Japan's shield. Now it burned. By 1945, Allied commanders in both the Pacific and Burma had grown weary of attritional warfare. Every cave, every bunker, every ridge demanded blood. Generals like William Slim, commanding the British 14th Army in Burma, and Simon Buckner and Roy Geiger in Okinawa understood a grim equation. The Japanese would not surrender, and infantry assaults were slaughter. Leadership had to adapt to desperation. For Slim's forces in Burma, the jungle campaign was a logistical and psychological nightmare. Humidity rotted weapons, monsoons drowned supply lines, and malaria killed more men than bullets. Yet, Slim understood that victory depended on momentum. He authorized the use of Churchill crocodiles to accompany infantry columns through Mandalay, Maiktila, and later the drive to Rangoon. He called them the equalizer. In Slim's memoirs, he wrote that once the crocodiles arrived, our advance gained a fire that no bunker could withstand. His officers quickly realized these machines could substitute for days of bombardment. One pass of a crocodile was often more effective than hours of artillery. In the Pacific, American leadership adopted the same ruthless pragmatism. At Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Holland Smith deployed flamethrower Shermans in small teams alongside marine assault units. On Okinawa, they became essential components of the flame and demolition groups, integrated units that worked in perfect synchronization. Infantry located the caves, engineers marked targets, and the tanks burned them. Colonel David M. Shoup, later a Medal of Honor recipient, wrote after the battle, "We did not need to ask if a position was neutralized. If the flame went in, it was over." This doctrine of systematic annihilation was not born of cruelty, but of necessity. The Japanese garrisons refused to surrender, and every day of hesitation cost hundreds of lives. Commanders used flame not only to destroy positions, but to demoralize entire defensive sectors. Leadership in this phase of the war no longer sought maneuvers or breakthroughs. It sought finality, and fire provided it. For the Japanese army, the arrival of flamethrower tanks was not just a tactical problem, it was a spiritual crisis. Japanese infantry doctrine was rooted in Bushido, the samurai code of honor emphasizing loyalty, courage, and the acceptance of death. Soldiers were trained to endure pain and to kill or die without hesitation. Against bullets, shells, or bayonets, this code provided strength. Against fire, it faltered. Inside bunkers, defenders watched as flames crawled through firing slits and rolled across ceilings. There was no defense, no countermeasure, no escape. The same terrain that once concealed them now trapped them. Japanese officers reported growing signs of panic behavior among their men. Diaries recovered after battles describe soldiers trembling, covering their faces, or attempting to flee even before a tank came into view. One entry from a sergeant on Luzon reads, "The tank came again. We prayed. The air became light, burning light. I could not move my legs. The others screamed until there were no others." Commanders tried to adapt. Anti-tank teams were trained to attack fuel trailers with grenades or satchel charges. Others dug pits filled with spikes or concealed mines. But against coordinated Allied units, such measures were rarely effective. Japanese tanks offered no answer. The Type 95 Heigo, though nimble, could not penetrate Allied armor. Its thin plating ignited easily when struck by a single shell. Many crews chose to die in place rather than retreat. As the war dragged on, morale fractured. Letters from the front hinted at resignation, not defeat, but the slow realization that courage was no match for industrial firepower. When fire entered the battlefield, ideology burned with it. There was something primal about the weapon. Fire, humanity's first tool, had returned as its darkest invention. Among Allied soldiers, the use of flamethrowers and crocodiles stirred unease. Few doubted their necessity, but many questioned their cost. In letters and reports, Marines described the horror in detached tones, as if to shield themselves from what they witnessed. A corporal on Okinawa wrote, "You don't shoot men when they're burning. You just watch." For commanders, the moral line blurred under the weight of necessity. Fire saved Allied lives, ended battles faster, and forced surrenders that no bomb or bullet could. Yet it also inflicted a kind of suffering that haunted those who saw it. Even hardened veterans described the aftermath in whispers: blackened figures frozen in final gestures, caves glowing like forges. Journalists and war correspondents were rarely allowed to film close-range flame attacks. The images were too disturbing for public morale. Still, within the military, there were quiet debates. Was it right to use such weapons, even against an enemy who refused mercy? Or had total war erased the question altogether? British officers in Burma noted that the crocodiles, though effective, produced a silence after battle that men did not speak of. American commanders called them merciful in speed, merciless in method. Fire was efficient, yes, but it left no dignity in death. The moral weight extended beyond the battlefield. After the war, many veterans refused to discuss flame operations. Some spoke of recurring nightmares, the sound of the projector firing, the rush of oxygen consumed, the smell that never left their minds. And yet, without them, countless Allied soldiers might never have returned home. That contradiction, the salvation and the horror of fire, would define the legacy of these machines long after. The guns went silent. In the jungles of Burma and the islands of the Pacific, leadership had harnessed fire to end a war. The enemy had met it with courage that could not prevail, and morality itself had been scorched by necessity. But in 1945, as the Allies approached Japan's final strongholds, the full scale of this inferno would reach its peak. In battles where the ground itself seemed to burn. Okinawa. April 1945, the island was barely 70 miles long, but it became one of the most violent battlefields in human history. For 82 days, American and Japanese forces fought across its ridges and limestone caves, transforming the green hills into a landscape of ash. When the assault began, U.S. commanders expected another costly but swift victory. Instead, they found an underground fortress. The Shuri Line, the heart of Japanese resistance, was a labyrinth of bunkers, tunnels, and interlocking fields of fire. Every hill concealed a fortress. Every fortress concealed men ready to die. Artillery and naval bombardments lasted days, but when the smoke cleared, the Japanese were still there. Machine guns opened. Mortars fell. Marines advanced and fell in waves. Entire companies disappeared into the mud. And then the flamethrower tanks arrived. Sherman Zippos rumbled forward behind bulldozers that cleared paths through the debris. Their turrets turned toward the mouth of the first cave system, a position that had resisted for over a week. Infantry crouched low behind them, rifles trembling. The order came: fire. A jet of flame burst from the Sherman's hull, arcing through the humid air like molten lightning. It struck the rock face and exploded inward, pouring liquid fire into the cave. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hill itself seemed to breathe flame. Smoke vented from cracks, and the ground trembled with muffled screams. The Marines didn't cheer. They simply moved on. The next cave awaited. Hour after hour, day after day, the same ritual unfolded. Tanks advanced, fired, reversed, refueled. Infantry followed, sealing entrances with grenades and demolition charges. The air filled with soot and the smell of burned vegetation. The jungle canopy wilted and blackened. The Japanese countered with everything they had. At night, Suicide teams crawled through the mud, carrying satchel charges to throw beneath the tanks. Some made it. Others were cut down by machine guns before reaching their targets. The flame projectors themselves became targets of obsession. Japanese troops aimed specifically for the nozzle or the fuel line, hoping to ignite the tanks in spectacular death. But the Sherman Zippos held. Their armor shrugged off small arms fire, and the crews fought with mechanical precision. Each morning, they returned to the same killing fields, methodically incinerating anything that moved. One Marine officer at Okinawa wrote later, "The fire tanks broke the island's heart. After them, there was only silence." By mid-May, the Japanese line began to disintegrate. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, chief of operations for the 32nd Army, watched as the unrelenting flame ate through his defenses. He later admitted, "We could fight the guns, we could endure the shells, but fire, it broke the spirit." For the Americans, progress came at a terrible price. The island became a graveyard of steel and flesh. Rain mixed with ash to form rivers of black mud. Burned bodies lay half-buried, unrecognizable. But the advance continued, driven by the grim logic of total war. Destroy everything that could fight. At one position near Shuri Castle, 6 Japanese bunkers were linked by tunnels. For weeks, they resisted continuous bombardment. Nothing penetrated, until the flamethrower tanks arrived. In one afternoon, the entire complex was reduced to smoke and silence. Witnesses described the spectacle as both awe-inspiring and unbearable. A Navy photographer later wrote, "You could feel the heat from 100 yards away. The flame reached into the earth itself. Each success made the next assault easier." Japanese soldiers began abandoning their posts, fleeing through the night toward the southern cliffs of the island. Some leaped into the sea rather than face the flames. Others fought until their bunkers collapsed around them. The battle for Okinawa was not only a victory of firepower, it was a psychological collapse. The myth of the indestructible Japanese defense cracked under the roar of mechanized flame. When Shuri Castle finally fell on May 29th, the once grand structure was little more than charred rubble. Underneath its ruins lay hundreds of burned tunnels, the tomb of the Japanese 32nd Army. For the first time, U.S. commanders saw what might await them if they invaded the Japanese home islands. 1 million defenders hidden in caves, prepared to fight to the death. And they knew the only weapon capable of rooting them out was fire. The lesson of Okinawa would shape the next and most terrifying phase of the war. When the battle for Okinawa reached its final month, the island had become unrecognizable, a landscape of blackened stone, smoke, and silence. The once lush jungle had been stripped bare by artillery and fire. Hills that once pulsed with life now glowed faintly at night, the earth still smoldering from the flamethrower tanks' passage. By June 1945, Japanese resistance had splintered, but surrender was unthinkable. Groups of soldiers and civilians withdrew to the cliffs near Mabuni, clinging to the last defensible terrain. There, in caves overlooking the sea, the final confrontation unfolded. Sherman Zippos led the way once again. Their tracks clattered over the rocks, their engines echoing across the cliffs. Each tank crew knew what awaited them: close quarters, mines, suicide charges. The men inside spoke little. They had done this before. They knew the sound of their own weapon too well. At Mabuni, the Japanese defenders fought with a kind of doomed defiance. They fired from cave mouths, sniped from cracks in the cliffs, and hurled grenades into advancing infantry columns. When Allied artillery failed to dislodge them, the call went out once more. "Bring the flame!" The tanks rolled forward under the cover of machine gun fire. They aimed not for the cliffs themselves, but for the air holes and crevices that marked the hidden tunnels. The first burst of flame hit low, filling the cave with pressurized fire. Seconds later, orange light erupted from the openings above, a chain reaction of fire and air. Inside, entire platoons were erased. There were no survivors, only blackened stone and silence. The heat was so intense that limestone fused into glass. To the American infantry, the spectacle was both terrible and mesmerizing. They advanced through the haze, their boots sinking into ash. There was no resistance, only the quiet crackle of flame dying out. Farther north, British forces in Burma faced their own inferno. At Mektila, the crocodiles of the 25th Dragoons moved through narrow jungle tracks to clear the last Japanese strongpoints. Each target was an underground bunker, reinforced, well-armed, and invisible until it fired. Infantry pinned the defenders while the crocodiles took aim. When the fuel ignited, the entire hillside seemed to breathe. Flames jetted across trenches, licked through firing slits, and rolled over the ground like living things. Japanese soldiers who escaped the initial blast fled into the open, only to be cut down by rifle fire. Within hours, what had been a fortified position became a cratered ruin. For General Slim's men, the sight of crocodiles in action was unforgettable. He later wrote that the tanks spared us the cost of another 1,000 graves. Yet, he also admitted that watching them work was to see war stripped of all humanity. Across the theaters of Asia and the Pacific, this was the pattern: resistance, flame, silence. The technology was simple, but its psychological power was absolute. Fire robbed men of courage faster than bullets or bombs. Japanese commanders tried to instill new discipline, ordering soldiers to remain in place no matter what weapon approached. Some units even dug water pits inside caves in a desperate attempt to counter the heat. None of it mattered. Fire consumed air as well as flesh. Once ignited, the cave itself became the weapon's ally. Eyewitnesses spoke of the jungle glowing red at night, as if the very soil was aflame. Columns of smoke hung for days. The smell carried for miles. Even animals fled. The forests emptied of birds. The ground silent except for distant engines, and the occasional roar of another flame burst. By the end of June, Okinawa was declared secure. In Burma, the road to Rangoon lay open. Yet victory brought no triumph. Soldiers walked through ruins so complete that they seemed unreal, a world reduced to ash and mud. One Marine corporal wrote home, "We burned the island until there was nothing left to fight for." In Tokyo, military strategists analyzed the reports. They knew what fire had done to Okinawa and Burma. They knew that if the Allies landed on the home islands, these same machines, multiplied 100-fold, would lead the way. And somewhere above those burning jungles, the shadow of a new weapon already loomed, one that would burn brighter and deadlier than anything before. But before that day came, the flamethrower tanks had already rewritten the language of fear. They had turned courage into vapor and the jungle into memory. From Saipan to Rangoon, one lesson echoed: when steel carries fire, no fortress is safe. When the fires finally died on Okinawa and Burma, the scale of destruction was beyond measure. What the artillery had shattered, the flamethrower tanks had erased. Entire hillsides had collapsed into hollow shells of fused rock. The once green canopy of Burma now stood in skeletal form. Trees stripped of leaves, their trunks scorched black like the bones of the earth. The official reports from both theaters spoke in numbers, not emotions. In Okinawa alone, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed. Tens of thousands more civilians perished, many by suicide or trapped in burning caves. American losses were also staggering. Over 12,000 killed, 50,000 wounded. But for every Allied soldier who died, 10 Japanese defenders fell. The British campaign in Burma, though smaller in scale, mirrored the same grim arithmetic. At Mektila and Mandalay, Churchill Crocodiles supported Indian and British infantry, burning through entrenched resistance that had stalled earlier offensives. The reports praised their remarkable efficiency in clearing fortified positions. Behind that bureaucratic phrase lay scenes of unimaginable horror. Caves reduced to molten stone, trenches filled with ash. For the Allies, these weapons had proven indispensable. Commanders hailed them as decisive instruments of victory. In the Pacific, Marine General Roy Geiger declared that the flamethrower tank shortened the war and saved lives. British officers called the Crocodile the terror of Burma. Yet, even in triumph, there was unease. Soldiers who had operated or followed behind the flame tanks spoke rarely of their work. When they did, their tone was subdued. Not proud, but weary. Many described dreams of fire that lingered long after the war. Some developed lasting guilt, though they had done nothing outside orders. The Japanese records tell the other half of the story. Intelligence reports recovered from caves after Okinawa revealed a shift in morale so profound it bordered on despair. The phrase "honor without air" appeared in several diaries, a haunting reference to soldiers who suffocated in sealed bunkers rather than burn. Post-war interrogations confirmed what Allied troops had witnessed. The flamethrower tank was more feared than any other weapon. Not the bomb, not the shell, but the fire that crawled into the ground. Japanese prisoners spoke of comrades abandoning their positions, breaking ranks, or committing suicide before the tanks arrived. The terror was not irrational. The weapons left nothing intact. Unlike shell fire, which could miss or wound, flame consumed. It offered no chance of redemption, no opportunity to die fighting. It transformed brave men into silhouettes. In strategic terms, the lessons were clear. Fire could succeed where bombardment failed. It was a weapon of precision and finality. The British Army began studying ways to adapt Crocodile systems for urban warfare. The U.S. Marine Corps pushed for new flamethrower vehicles in anticipation of the invasion of Japan. Both militaries concluded that the psychological effect of fire was as valuable as its physical destruction. But behind those conclusions lay a truth no report could disguise. The jungles of Asia had become laboratories of annihilation. Warfare had evolved from the clash of armies to the incineration of spaces. In Okinawa, the survivors, soldiers and civilians alike, emerged from the caves to a world unrecognizable. The air still smelled of gasoline weeks after the battle. Villages lay flattened, fields scorched, rivers choked with ash. One Japanese nurse later wrote, "The island was gray. Even the sea seemed burned." The Allies had achieved their goal. The Japanese defense was broken, and the road to victory was open. Yet, the price of that victory was the death of innocence, both for the people who suffered it and for those who delivered it. And as Allied planners turned their eyes toward the Japanese mainland, they knew the next battle would make even Okinawa seem small, unless something or someone brought the war to an end first. By the summer of 1945, the lessons of the jungle had hardened into doctrine. Fire was now a tool of inevitability, a weapon designed not merely to kill, but to extinguish resistance itself. In the Pacific, U.S. engineers were already producing hundreds of additional flame tanks in preparation for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Reports from Okinawa and Iwo Jima were studied line by line. The conclusion was chillingly clear. Japan's underground defenses, riddled with caves and tunnels, would demand fire on an unimaginable scale. The estimates were grim. Allied planners predicted up to 1 million casualties if an invasion occurred. Japanese and Allied combined. Every coastal city, every mountain range would become another Okinawa. In training manuals distributed to tank crews and engineers, flamethrower tactics occupied entire sections. The instructions were methodical, clinical, detached. Projector bursts of 2 to 3 seconds. Sweep the aperture. Repeat until no return fire. But before the invasion could begin, another form of fire fell from the sky. In August 1945, the atomic bombs struck Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended within days. Japan surrendered, and the invasion never came. The flamethrower tanks stood ready on Pacific Islands, silent, fueled, waiting for orders that never arrived. Their crews, hardened by months of combat, looked toward Japan's burning cities and understood that the weapon of fear had simply changed shape. The crocodiles and Zippos had burned through the jungles. Now the atomic bomb had burned through civilization itself. After the surrender, Allied occupation forces toured the battlefields of Burma, the Philippines, and Okinawa. They found the remains of Japanese fortifications, blackened caverns, melted machine guns, and bones fused into the rock. Many of the caves still smelled faintly of kerosene. The vegetation had begun to return, timid green shoots breaking through the gray. But beneath the soil lay the memory of heat that had once been absolute. In post-war analyses, historians and military engineers agreed. The flamethrower tank had been among the most psychologically effective weapons of the Second World War. It had turned the advantage of defense into terror. It had allowed armies to advance where no infantry could. But it had also revealed something deeper, that fear could be engineered. The technology survived long after the war. Crocodiles remained in British service into the 1950s. The U.S. continued to develop flamethrower vehicles for Korea and Vietnam. Each generation grew more efficient, more precise, and each carried the same moral weight. Fire was still the weapon that could not be looked at for too long. For Japan, the legacy of those jungle fires lingered for decades. Entire villages had vanished in the war's final months. Survivors spoke of the heat, the noise, and the light, the way the jungle glowed like a sunrise that never ended. Monuments were later raised on Okinawa and in Burma, but many of the dead were never recovered. Their resting places remained sealed caves, marked only by the memory of flame. Among Allied veterans, memories of the flamethrower tanks lived quietly, buried under years of silence. Some never spoke of it again. Others, in interviews decades later, still paused when describing what they had seen. One British tanker said softly, "It was necessary. That doesn't mean it was right." The flamethrower tank had won battles, saved lives, and shortened the war. But it had also shown how far human ingenuity could go in perfecting destruction. When historians looked back on the Pacific and Burma campaigns, they saw more than strategy or technology. They saw what happens when an empire built on devotion meets an army built on industrial will, when belief collides with machinery and the jungle itself becomes witness. The war had ended, but the memory of those burning jungles, of steel beasts exhaling fire, remained, a lesson and a warning. The flames were gone, but their light still lingered, not in the forests of Asia, but in the conscience of mankind. War has always been an act of invention. From stone to steel, from gas to fire, each generation reshapes destruction into something more complete. Yet few weapons have revealed the human cost of progress as clearly as the flamethrower tank. In the jungles of Burma and the cliffs of Okinawa, it wasn't simply technology that triumphed. It was will. Fire became a language through which the modern world declared its arrival, a symbol of total control. But in its glow, one could also see the shadow of what was lost: restraint, empathy, and the idea that war might still have limits. The crocodile and the Sherman Zippo were not instruments of cruelty by design. They were products of desperation. Each burst of flame represented another attempt to survive a war that no longer offered clean victories. They were made by men who feared dying in the dark, and used by men who understood what it meant to burn another alive. And did it anyway, because history demanded it. After 1945, as new weapons emerged, Atomic, chemical, digital. The image of those tanks pushing through the jungle still haunted the edges of military memory. They were relics of a time when courage met fire, and fear became the most powerful weapon of all. Today, when we look back at those battles, it is not the triumphs we remember most vividly, but the light, that terrible, living light that rolled across the earth and swallowed everything in its path. It burned the jungle. It burned the enemy. And, in ways unseen, it burned the soul of those who watched it happen. That is the legacy of the flamethrower tank. A weapon that ended wars, but left behind a scar the world can still feel when the night is quiet and the air smells faintly of smoke. They called them crocodiles and Zippos, steel beasts born from desperation, carrying a weapon older than war itself. In Burma, they burned through the roots of empire. In Okinawa, they turned cliffs into fire and caves into tombs. They were not just machines of victory, but reminders of how far humanity was willing to go to end its own suffering. For those who fought beside them, the memory never faded. The sound, the heat, the light. To them, the war would always smell faintly of gasoline, and yet, for all its horror, fire became a teacher. It showed the world that even in victory, there can be loss, that no side leaves the battlefield untouched. Decades later, the jungle took back its silence. But beneath the soil, the ghosts of that flame still sleep.